Welcome to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. On today's show, we're throwing back to a special interview I had with Kevin Obi. With more than 25 years of business experience at world-class corporates, Obi was recently listed in the Financial Times as one of the top 100 black and minority influencers in the UK tech sector. Now at the top of his field, Obi and a group of his peers have decided to focus their attention on what matters most, giving back to those who might otherwise go without. Kevin Obi, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. I'm not sure if you've been on Channels TV before. Is this a first for you?
This is the first for me.
Wow, and it's in the London studio.
Absolutely.
So we're very lucky to have you. I've got to read this because I don't want to get this wrong, because I've got to extend a congratulations to you on being recognised as one of the most influential black, Asian and minority ethnic leaders in technology by the Financial Times and Inclusive Board.
Thank you very much.
That's amazing. I'm sure over the years you've had several accolades. How does this compare?
Well, it's nice. I think someone an old friend contacted me and said, congratulations. And I said, thank you. And they joked that, Kevin, they probably gave it to you because you've been around a long time. I kind of feel that. So it's a nice accolade.
What do you think of the BAME title? Because I've noticed recently that there seems to be a lot of these big establishments that are, you know, shortlisting BAME people for their achievements. Have you noticed that as well, that there seem to be a lot more frequent?
Well, it's not a bad thing. I mean, you think about it, 20 years ago, nothing like that ever happened. You would not have the Financial Times publishing something like that. So I think you can take it too seriously, or you can just say, look, it's great publicity, it's some degree of recognition, it's an acknowledgement that this is an issue. We shouldn't knock it.
It's an achievement.
It's a nice accolade.
It's a nice accolade. Hopefully I'll be getting one in a few years. But, you know, you said yourself you've been around a long time.
Yes.
You've worked for, you know, the most established British firms, international companies.
Yes.
You've worked as a consultant. You've also worked in digital marketing.
Yeah.
But we're here today to talk about Nigeria's internally displaced people.
Yes.
I don't know if I would call you, if I can call you a philanthropist, but just explain to me why and how, especially with your professional background, this has become a key issue for you.
Well, a couple of years ago, a friend from Nigeria came to London on holiday, and he pointed out the IDP problem to me, and I thought, and he asked we should do something about it. And he was with a group that was already providing support to IDPs in northern Nigeria, and felt that more people in the diaspora needed to do something about it. So I thought, great, good idea that we should do something about it. And the funny thing about life is when someone tells you about something, all of a sudden you start to notice in the newspapers every articles about the same thing. And it's about sensitivity. So I think what happened to me is I started noticing something. I said, right, we need to do something about this. And my initial idea was to get a British aid agency called Doctors of the World to help. In my professional career, their president I had been her client. So I thought the best way to do was to go to their offices, get them aware of the issue, and support them for them to go in and try and help and make a difference. Unfortunately, for all sorts of reasons, that didn't happen, and I found myself doing it myself,
wow,
which wasn't expected. But it's great. It's absolutely wonderful. I would say it is more satisfying than anything that I've achieved in my career professionally.
Why?
So that's good.
Why?
You see, people like me of a certain age felt like we got the best of Nigeria. You know, when we went to university, we were paid a bursary to go to university, certainly in my first year. I went to great schools. And there's so many of us, doctors, lawyers, people like me, who have done so well outside Nigeria. And it is what Nigeria has given us, the confidence about being Nigerians and being what we describe the best Nigeria has to offer. And we just felt that, certainly the group that I work with, that we need to give something back. And I do think that a lot of Nigerians in diaspora have a moral obligation to do so. Yeah. And we do find a lot of people are willing to support.
It's interesting you say that. And on this show, you know, we've spoken to several, you know, key members in the diaspora, like yourself, who sat where you sat. And they do feel the burden. You know, they go back a couple of times a year for work or for holidays. And they're like, you know, goodness me, you know, I've got to do something. I can't just dash somebody. I must do a lot more. But they found it very, very difficult. You know, some of the regions that they want to go to are no-go zones. And even if they're able to access those regions, there's an air of suspicion. So it's not as easy as it sounds. How has your project been received, and how have you managed to overcome those hurdles?
Well, I should go back a little bit and then I'll answer the question. My group is called NIdeas, and it's short for Nigerian IDP Diaspora Support Group. And we started probably about 3 years ago. We're a coalition of Nigerian professionals, both here, mainly here and in the US. There are a lot of people who are medical professionals who are part of us. And we are non-political. We have both Christians and Muslims. We have people from the north and people from the south. So it's a mixed group. Interesting mixed group. We're all volunteers. All the things we do are funded by us. We actually spend our own money. However, we've had some great support from people like Skib, which is an insurance broker in Nigeria. And we tend to work with international and local agencies in Nigeria. So the last set of programs we did on trauma counseling, we did it with the United Nations agency. That's, first of all, kind of a little bit of background. I think that the thing that we found kind of most challenging is twofold. The first is clearly raising money to go off and do these initiatives. That's the first thing. And I think the second thing is the logistics on the ground in Nigeria. I think to do anything in those regions, the most important and primary thing that you need is people on the ground who you trust. And we don't live there. So you need people to
You need the locals.
Yeah, in effect, local people, whether it's international agencies or local people, community groups in Nigeria, there to help you execute. So when we're starting to think of our next program in 2020, our approach is to use what we call the franchise approach. And we have 3 what we call local franchise partners that we're currently in discussion with about how we roll out sort of this art therapy program in the North Central and Northeast.
Yes, we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, but I want to talk particularly about the region, because of course we've seen, you know, history has taught us, isn't it, whether it's Auschwitz, whether it's Kosovo, whether it's Hiroshima, that, you know, there are consequences of war, there's consequences of conflict. But there's something about what's been happening in the Northeast, particularly with, of course, Boko Haram, that we're not talking about the consequences of this. The Northeast region appears to almost have been forgotten about. What have you found since, you know, starting your project and travelling to that region and, you know, working with these individuals, that some of the issues are?
I would say at the start, so if you go back to the crisis in the Northeast has been going on northern Nigeria as a whole has been going on for about 10 years now. And I would say the IDP crisis probably shorter than that, maybe anything up to 6 years. I would say initially the response of the international agencies, if you go back to sort of 2015, even to a certain extent 2016, but mainly 2015 and 14, you would probably find that there was a lot of criticism about them, but they've kind of put resources and tried to help Nigeria as a country. If I'm perfectly honest, we as Nigeria haven't done great. Currently, I think I was reading somewhere that in the Lake Chad Basin, there's something like 2.6 million displaced people, of which about 1.8 million are Nigerians, and the rest are from the countries around the Lake Chad region. But I think the conflict is quite complicated, or the IDP situation is quite complicated, because on one hand, you have the kind of the Lake Chad Basin area, which was if you call it the epicenter, because, you know, that was the area around kind of the Boko Haram issues and incidences. But then if you go just slightly further to the east, there's a conflict in Cameroon. And suddenly we're seeing hundreds of thousands of displaced people from those conflict areas in Cameroon coming into eastern Nigeria. So that's another set of conflict that's driving issues. The third thing is that the Nigerian army and the multinational joint task force have done well in pushing back some of the insurgency.
Really?
Yes, but what we find is that, you know, if you read the latest UNHCR reports, that's popping up in other regions in the Sahel part of Africa, just north of Nigeria. But also it's beginning to spread to the kind of northwest and north central in terms of Sokoto State and Zamfara State. And it feels like when you read it that it's another insurgent group, not necessarily part of what's happening in the northeast. But it's a real worry that you almost have kind of three types of conflict which are kind of brewing and each causing sort of a number of internally displaced people within Nigeria. And indeed, sometimes there are instances where people in Nigeria, for example, in the northwest, have fled to countries north of Nigeria, like Niger, for refuge rather than staying in their home. So it is quite a complicated situation and indeed difficult. I think the thing that just strikes me is the numbers are staggering. You know, 2.6 million in the Chad Basin alone. And you just don't simply hear enough about it. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a complaint when, you know, one of the agencies, I was talking to them, and they were saying a similar problem had arisen in East Africa. And within a month, $16 million was raised for that. But you don't hear a lot of activity, certainly not here, about, you know, agencies and people looking
and fundraising.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not attractive, is it?
Well, I do think that the international agencies, people like Action Against Hunger, Mercy Corps, a lot of them who are funded by government, are doing a heck of a lot in that region, UNHCR. But, you know, it would be great to just hear a little bit more and for Nigeria to get a little bit more support from wider support around the world.
But I want to talk about the clash, the tension, because there certainly does appear to be some sort of fight back between a lot of these African governments or these local communities that are having issues and aid organisations or diaspora groups. We saw it with Ebola and the World Health Organization. You know, the World Health Organization, they came out and they apologised, saying, you know, yes, they did get a lot of things wrong. We're also seeing it now between the Nigerian government and some aid organisations that are working with the Northeast. Also as well, Amnesty International, anytime they release a statement, you usually have somebody in the government that says, you know, that's absolute lies. Is that a reality that, you know, there are things that are wrong? Is it the nuances? Is it the culture? Are sometimes aid organisations too quick to judge?
I'll tell you a story. When I first started this thing and I was working with an international aid agencies, why we sort of agreed not to continue was two reasons. The first is that when we decided that we were planning missions in northern Nigeria, they insisted that we couldn't have security with us. And I thought, how can you be in those regions without security? And they said that their ethos is that they need to be seen as neutral. And therefore, if they have police security or army security, it can be perceived that they're for one side rather than for the other.
Wow.
Now, that is naive and to a certain extent crazy. The doctors in my group thought, you know, we cannot do it.
No way.
Yeah, exactly.
Count me out,
Yeah,
Kevin.
exactly. So we sort of parted ways. Now, if you look and you read some of the things that are being said by some of the agencies, recently two major agencies, Action Against Hunger and Mercy Corps, had issues with the Nigerian government. And you can kind of see both sides, because what's happened is that outside the main conurbation, in parts of areas where I understand the government has taken back, they have these things called garrison towns, which are safe enclaves where the Nigerian soldiers positioned there. Yes. And, you know, there are people living within those communities. Now, the challenge is, on one hand, the aid agencies will say they're not reaching everyone if they're only serving the garrison communities.
Yes.
Whereas, you know, the Nigerian military argues that outside those garrison communities, that they feel that some of the people in those communities might be supporting insurgency. Yes, yes. Now, I don't know what's right or what's wrong, but I think you can see both sides, and it's difficult for anybody to judge what's the best way forward.
Coming up, more chat with one of the Nigerian diaspora's most accomplished businessmen, Kevin Obi. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. On today's show, we're throwing back to a special interview I had with Kevin Obi, an accomplished businessman with over 25 years of senior corporate experience. Obi is also the chair and founder of the Nigerian IDP Diaspora Support Group, a not-for-profit organisation working independently from international aid organisations and the federal government to offer hope to those who need it most. Kevin Obi, welcome back to Channels Business Global. Now, before the break, we kind of touched on aid organisations across the globe. I feel personally that there are some conflicts that are just not attractive. Maybe not for the wider organisation, but for the public, because of course a lot of these groups get funding from public call-outs, don't they? Yeah. How does the diaspora differ? Because of course, again, Kevin, you've been living here for several years, I'm sure.
Yes.
A few decades.
Indeed.
And there is something about the diaspora. It's become a buzzword recently because of remittances, and we're travelling back and forth so much. But, you know, there are several diaspora groups that are doing work in Nigeria. Some are more successful than others. Do you think the diaspora have a responsibility, and are they taken seriously by aid groups?
I don't know. You see, the diaspora is a word that I just find very difficult. You know, it's in your title. Because I think it's a bit like saying the black community. It's like, what's the black community?
Bane.
Exactly. You know, there are many other people who, for example, have provided funds to me might not even be Nigerian. There's a great guy whose parents grew up then. He's an English guy, and he's kind of was happy to help.
Still supporting you.
Exactly. So I'm reluctant that you can just have this label that just sort of covers people of all shapes and colors and types who are Nigerian or connected to Nigeria, whether they're first generation or first, second, or third generation. So I would say the word diaspora in that sense is an amorphous mass that's difficult to put your head around. But I do think that various people in various ways try to help. And now we know that there are lots of challenges across Nigeria. So even if you're a person who sends money home to educate, you know, your mother's house girl or something, you're helping in your own way.
Yes.
So I do think that, you know, when you talk about the 26 billion in remittances that goes into Nigeria, I think, you know, from what I understand, it's now bigger than our oil revenue. It doesn't go on. In effect, it goes. It's
propping up the government, isn't it?
Well, not the government.
It's almost a welfare state.
No, it's propping up people. We've always been a welfare state. Even when I grew up in Nigeria, my father trained and educated lots of people. So that's just our culture.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we're almost running out of time, so I've got to talk about the Nigeria IDP Diaspora Support Group. Diaspora being the key, being the key word.
That's why we changed it to NIdeas.
Okay,
we just got rid of the
let's call it NIdeas.
Yeah.
Although it's made up of the diaspora, and we're proud of the work that you're doing. Talk to me about some of the projects you're working on now, some of the projects that you may be working on next year.
Okay, so in the past we've done 4 or 5 things. We did research on sort of some of the longer term issues. So if you look at the problem specifically with IDPs, there are 3 things we identified as being, or 3 or 4 things. The first is food security. And, you know, the food situation is very difficult. The second is personal security and safety. The third that we looked at was in research that we saw, we found that trauma was seen to be one of the biggest long-term issues, mental trauma that was inadequately provided for. I think there's some statistics that Nigeria has something like in the order of 200 psychiatrists for a country of 180 million.
Wow.
And in the Northeast, there's one mental hospital, there's another one in Kano. And my understanding is both of them are completely overwhelmed. So we decided that mental trauma was one of the areas we were going to do. We decided that you can't send psychiatrists to Nigeria for long periods of time.
Why?
So in partnership with a UN agency, we got a team of Nigerian psychiatrists here. We worked together to develop a trauma counseling program based on a WHO program from Rwanda. And what we've done is that we've gone to Nigeria on 2 occasions and delivered trauma counseling training to train about 100 trauma counselors in 2 goes. And what we've done is that we've taken people from the IDP communities and from some of the local NGOs, and we trained them as trauma counselors, because these were people in the community who were doing it anyway.
Wow.
And we were just
unqualified.
Exactly. And we were equipping them to actually do it more effectively.
Yes.
But also some of the aid workers were experiencing difficulties, so we trained them to be able to cope with it. Now, it doesn't address the problem in so much as trauma is an extensive issue and quite deep. 5 days training isn't going to make you a trauma counselor. Yes. But what it does is that it eases the pressure on the system. Yeah. And it addresses the cases that are not so severe. So I think that's the first thing that we did. The second thing we did is that I have the benefit of coming from a medical family. My father was a pediatrician and was actually awarded as Nigeria's Pediatrician of the Millennium. He was a professor in pediatrics. So in his memory, the second thing we did was run a child care program where in northern Nigeria, I led a team of pediatric doctors, excellent, fantastic women. Over a period of 5 days, we trained 471 children. Wow. We found 2 were critically ill and were dying. So what we arranged was for them to go to a teaching hospital in Nigeria and get treatment. And it's safe to say that they're alive now. Yeah. So it's nice to know that we actually saved lives. The third thing we did is that we arranged for surgery for a number of people who had gunshot wounds. We arranged for them to have kind of life-saving surgery. And then the fourth thing that we did is that we got some donations from PNG and sent a container load of relief items to an IDP camp. So I think in the past kind of 3 or 4 years, we've had 4 or 5
certainly dented your
initiatives, which have been both fulfilling and actually worthy in terms of the difference you make to people's lives. So that's been fun.
Do you feel like Britain are supporting Nigerians in Nigeria?
Absolutely. I think we have an absolutely brilliant High Commissioner in Katrina Lang. I know she's been and seen people in the IDP camps and how they live. And I know both the High Commission and the British government have a number of initiatives to help really focused on the people on the Northeast and saying how can they help them, you know, be safer, rebuild their livelihood. So I know that they've been considering a major rehabilitation program. And I think it is just down to the fact that, you know, the British government is supportive and we have an absolutely amazing High Commissioner in Katrina Lang.
Wow, Kevin, it is the season of giving back, and it's such an inspiring story of yours. I've got to ask, I know we've definitely run out of time, but any plans to take this outside of Nigeria? We are still the largest economy. We've got a lot of issues, but there are so many other African countries that could benefit from this type of work.
In all honesty, I think we're struggling.
Really?
Even in Nigeria, I think funding is always an issue. Logistics on the ground is always an issue. You know, we have a good support group, but a lot of the activity I sort of do in my spare time. So, I think...
have spare time, Kevin?
Well, I'm fortunate that my children have left home and I have an understanding wife. So,
okay.
it is a challenge. So, But, God willing, I do think that we'll be successful in 2020.
Well, 3 or 4 years to have achieved as much as you have, I'm sure, even the Nigerian government can feel your presence in that region. Kevin Obi, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. I look forward to welcoming you back. Or, coming along to one of those trips with security. With security. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Kevin Obi, recognised by the Financial Times for being one of Britain's top ethnic minorities influence in the tech sector. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.